Hey there, this is Kevin again, and thanks for joining me for Module 2 of the Ninja Japanese Sentence Formula. So in this module, I'm going to talk to you about particle mastery, and if you've spent any length of time studying or learning Japanese, I'm sure you know what a pain particles can be, but they are an important part of the Japanese language, and it is important to understand particles in order to speak and understand Japanese. So I'm going to try to go through them here and explain the most commonly used particles and their most common usages, so that hopefully, if this is something that you're struggling with, that you can get past this hurdle. So before we get started, what are particles and why are they important in the Japanese language? Well, we talked about the building blocks of sentences being subjects, verbs, and objects. Well, I like to think of particles as the mortar that kind of holds these building blocks together. So if you think about building a wall, for example, so you've got your subject, objects, and verbs kind of building up this wall. You can kind of imagine that the blue part of that this illustration here is the mortar that kind of holds everything together, that builds the wall, and that's what your particles do. They kind of connect the objects and the verbs and subjects together to form a coherent sentence. So there are a lot of particles, like I mentioned, and there's no way I can go through every single one. And I actually think by going through every single one doesn't really add much value. I think that if you can understand these 9 most commonly used particles, that you'll be in pretty good shape. So the particles that I'm going to go through in this module are wa. And for those of you who are studying the alphabet and say, wait a minute, that's ha. Yeah, it's written with the character ha, but when it's used as a particle, it's pronounced wa. Then we have ga, o, which is typically written in Romaji as wo, but it's pronounced o. To, mo, de, no, e. And this is another one where if you're studying the alphabet, you'll say, wait a minute, that's he, but that's correct. But when it's used as a particle, it's pronounced e. And ni. Alright, so let's start off with wa and ga, which I would argue are probably the most basic particles for sentences. And they are your subject markers. And what makes these two particles difficult is that they're both subject markers. So a lot of people say, well, when do I use which one? When do I use wa and when do I use ga? And that's a great question. So hopefully I'll be able to clear it up for you in this summary here. But when you use wa, think of it as placing emphasis on what follows the subject. So if you want to emphasize, not the subject itself, but what the subject is doing or something like that, you want to use wa. On the other hand, if you want to emphasize the subject itself, you'll want to use ga. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a couple examples. And I think leading by example is the best way to teach particles because, realistically in the real world, you're not going to have time to kind of recall, well, let me think, am I going to emphasize the subject or am I emphasizing the verb? I mean, there's just not enough time to analyze a sentence when you're hearing somebody speak or when you're trying to make a sentence. So really the best way is to kind of just intuitively understand. So I would say that if you kind of get what I'm trying to get across with these examples, that you're in really good shape. So example 1, if someone asks you, how are you getting to the party? And say you're thinking of driving to the party, right? So the piece of information that this person is trying to get from you is the means by which you are going to get to the party. So it's not you, but it's the driving part that you want to get across. You could answer by saying, watashi wa unten shite iku, which is I am going to drive or I'm driving, right? And so unten, which is underlined there, that means to drive. That is the part of the piece of information that they're after, and so by using wa, you emphasize that part of the sentence. So in contrast, let's take another example. If someone asks you, who's driving us to the party? Now in this case, you want to know who the particular individual is who is going to be driving to the party. So we know what the action is. We want to know, we're a little unsure about the subject. So in this case, you would say, watashi ga unten shite iku, or watashi, where that means I, right? We learned that earlier. watashi ga unten shite iku. That means I'm going to be the one who's driving. And because they're asking you who's going to be driving to the party, you can say, you can respond by using ga in that case. So, obviously you're not always going to be using sentences that respond to questions. But if you kind of think of it in this way, it's an easy way to get beyond the difficulty in using and differentiating wa and ga. Now, before I go on, I want to kind of just throw out a warning there that, wa and ga and the differences between these two particles is extremely difficult. And, even for people who have been studying Japanese, like myself, for a really long time, it's something that trips us up. And you can ask native Japanese speakers, and even to them, they may get the usage of wa and ga incorrectly. So it's just one of those things that over time, as you listen to more and more Japanese, it's going to become more intuitive to you, and you'll just know which one is correct to use. So as long as you understand the concept, I would say you're in good shape. Just try to get as much exposure to the language as possible so that when you go to speak Japanese, you'll intuitively feel, I think ga is the right particle to use here instead of wa, or vice versa. Alright, so the next important particle to learn is o. Now, o is your direct object marker, so you want to use it after objects. And an easy way to remember this, the way I like to think about it, is that, o sounds like the letter O, and, o is for objects, right? Pretty straightforward. So let's look at how the particle o is used in a real sentence. So let's take the example sentence, I'm drinking a beer. So, I'm drinking a beer in Japanese would be, watashi wa biiru o nonde imasu. So saying that a little bit slower, watashi wa biiru o nonde imasu. Right? So the o there is identifying the object, which is beer, and nonde imasu is drinking, which is the verb, right? Now, just kind of tying it back with our previous discussion about wa and ga, the reason why we want to use wa in this sentence is because the sentence is I'm drinking a beer. Now, if the sentence had been it is I who is drinking a beer, then it would be watashi ga, right? So that's the difference, just to hammer that point in one more time. All right, the next particles I want to go over are to and mo. Now, I kind of feel like, besides the fact that they rhyme, I kind of feel like these two particles belong to the same general family of particles. So I decided to put them on the same page here. But let's start with to. So when you see to, T-O, think of together, T-O, because this particle is used to represent the words with or and. So let's look at an example sentence where to is used as to mean with. So I am having lunch with Aaron. This sentence in Japanese would be watashi wa Aaron to ranchi o shiteru. So because I'm having lunch with Aaron, I put the to after Aaron. Now let's look at another example where to is used to mean and. So if I wanted to say, I ordered edamame and beer. So maybe you're talking about your night out on the town and what you had at the izakaya in Shibuya or something. You could answer, or you could say rather, watashi wa edamame to biiru o chumon shita. So I ordered edamame and beer. So edamame, between the words edamame and beer, you want to put a to. So if you have a list that has more than 2 items, you would just put a to between each of the items. So if you wanted to say edamame, beer, and chuhai, for example, which is another alcoholic Japanese drink, you could say, watashi wa edamame to biiru to chuhai o chumon shita. So chumon means to order, in case you're wondering. So that's how you use to for lists and when you're trying to explain or trying to say and in a Japanese sentence. The next one is, let's move on to mo, all right? So when I think of mo, it means also, but I kind of think of me too. So kind of take the M from me and the O at the end of to, and you got mo, right? It's a bit of a stretch, but I think it's an easy way to remember mo. So if we look at a sample sentence, maybe let's say Aaron also ordered edamame and beer. So we can use that exact same sentence that we use in example 2, change watashi to Aaron because that's the subject now, and now since it's also, we get rid of wa and we swap it out with mo. So now we have Aaron mo edamame to biru o chumon shita. So that means Aaron also ordered edamame and beer. Got it? Alright, so let's take a look at de. So de is used when you're trying to say by means of or at. So let me give you some examples. If you wanted to say, I'll be going by train or I'm going by train, you would say, watashi wa densha de iku. Watashi wa densha de iku. So densha is train, iku is to go. So you link those two words together using de because what you're trying to get across is that you're going somewhere by means of train. Okay? So let's look at another example. Where do you want to eat? So although this doesn't explicitly have the word at in it, you can kind of think of this sentence as being, where do you want to eat at, right? So this is a case where you also would use de, and this in Japanese is, doko de taberu? Doko de taberu. So doko is where, taberu is to eat. So where do you want to eat at? You would use de to string those two parts of the sentence together. Make sense? All right, so let's look at no. So no is your possessive marker, and this one's pretty straightforward. You can kind of think of the English equivalent as being apostrophe s, right? So, and a good way to remember no is, if you have something of yours, and somebody that you have someone off the street, for example, asks you, hey, can I borrow that, or will you loan that to me? Your gut instinct will probably be no, right? So you can kind of remember no as being a possessive marker. So this one should be pretty straightforward, but let's go through an example. If you wanted to say, we're having a party at Aaron's apartment, you would say in Japanese, Aaron no apato de party o suru. So again, I use de because this is at Aaron's apartment, right? And I use no in between Aaron and apato, which is apartment, because it's Aaron's apartment. So, Aaron no apato de party o suru. Alright. Alright, so we're on the home stretch, so hang in there, we're almost at the end. Let's start off with e. So, e is a direction particle, and it means to. So, whenever you're thinking about going somewhere or that type of sentence, you're going to want to use e. An example is, I'm going to Japan. You might remember this from Module 1. And if you recall, in Japanese this is watashi wa Nihon e iku, going to Japan. Another place you'll see e very commonly being used is for promotional materials for Japan or posters when you arrive in Japan, because welcome to Japan uses this e as well. So it's Nihon e yokoso, right? It's welcome to Japan. So keep your eye out for that. So ni is a little bit more complicated because there's a few usages for the particle, and I have written down here direction and time, but it's also used for indirect objects, and I have that in parentheses because I'm not going to cover it in this video because I think it's a little bit outside the scope, because I think more than anything ni is used for direction and time. I'd say that's probably the more common usages for ni. So in terms of time, an example would be, I'll go at 8 o'clock. I'll go somewhere at 8 o'clock. You could say, 8時に行く. 8時に行く. And just because it says at, don't get confused and use de by accident, because de is a location at, whereas ni is a time at, right? So there's a bit of a nuance difference there, so be careful about that. So my next example is, I'm going to Japan. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, we just covered that. That's watashi wa Nihon e iku, right? No, well, yeah, that's right. But you can also replace or interchange the e with a ni, and that gives you watashi wa Nihon ni iku, and this is completely valid as well. And I'm going to have to put an exclamation point on this page because these overlapping usages for ni and e is a point of confusion for a lot of people. And personally, I don't really know what the reason is in terms of why both particles can be used in this way. My guess is that e is more for written Japanese, and it probably has a minute nuance difference. But in my experience using the language, I would say ni is more commonly used for spoken Japanese, and I would say that when in doubt, use ni. So that's my personal judgment call. If you've heard differently or know differently, I'd be interested to hear. So shoot me an email if you know the mystery behind this this overlapping usage of e and ni. So that was all 9 particles I promised I'd go over. But after all that hard work, I have some bad news for you. And the bad news is Japanese people drop particles out of their sentences completely sometimes. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, why do we even learn particles if they're just going to drop them out of their sentences anyway? And I don't have a good answer for you, but I wanted to make you aware of this this point about drop particles, because it does it is very common, especially in spoken Japanese. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So here's a sentence that means today is hot, isn't it? And on the left-hand side, we have kyou wa atsui desu ne. So you can see the wa is in the sentence. This is kind of the way you might learn it in a textbook. But on the right-hand side, you have kyou atsui desu ne, and you notice the wa isn't there. But this is probably the way you will hear a native Japanese person say this sentence. They'll drop the wa completely. It sounds very natural, and it's much more fluid. When you hear a Japanese sentence dropping particle, take note of it, because next time when you say that sentence in Japanese, you'll know that you can drop the particle too, and that just makes your life that much easier. So I guess that pretty much closes Module 2. Again, I hope you got some valuable information out of this module, and once you're ready, I'll see you in Module 3.